Hello, everybody. It's Denis Spearman here from Danos Associates. I'm one of the partners. I manage the European Compliance and Financial Crime practice, and I'm very delighted today to be joined by Alan Ketley, who is the Executive Secretary of the Wolfsberg Group. Alan is going to talk to us today about his role within the Wolfsberg Group, as well as part of the Pathway to Success podcast, talk a little bit about his career and what his kind of top tips are for succeeding in the world of financial crime compliance. So welcome, Alan, and thank you so much for doing this. If I could ask you to give us a very quick overview of your career to date, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. This is something I've been looking forward to doing. So so I'm the Executive Secretary of the Wolfsberg Group. I've had that role since October last year. Prior to that, I've been a banker all of my working life. I started at Lloyds Bank in the overseas division in London immediately after university. They put me through a training program which I probably didn't appreciate the value of at the time. I spent nearly 3.5 years with the other graduate trainees working in all the international operations departments in London. And I've come back to the skills that I learned in that process many times during my career. Moved to New York in 1987. My first management position was in correspondent banking. New York was meant to be 3 years and then go home. It didn't work out that way. I'm still in New York. So correspondent banking was the center of my career for a long time. I transitioned out of it into corporate cash management because I thought, hey, I know how to sell cash management to banks. I can do it to corporates. Boy, was I surprised. Very different world. And then I at that time, I was working for a bank that had got itself into regulatory trouble. And so compliance was staffing up. And I got a phone call from the Chief Operating Officer of Compliance asking if I would be interested in joining. I was ready for a change. And part of me wondered, well, how bad could it be? But I will always remember one of the things that this person said to me, and Denise, if you're watching, thank you again. I said, why me? I don't know anything about compliance. I've never run a team. And she said, well, you can learn about compliance, but day one, given the business knowledge that you have, you take away the business people's ability to say you people in compliance don't understand how my business works. And that appealed to me. So I'm in compliance. I'm this newbie. I don't know anything about the law. I'm surrounded by people who are talking about regulation this, regulation that, case studies this, case studies that. And it took me a while before I realized that I actually had something to say in this, because they knew the law, but they didn't know how money moved. They knew the cases and the regulations, but they didn't know how letters of credit worked. And I, just happens to be that money movement is probably one of the bigger risks in financial crime. So I fitted in quite nicely. After that, I switched around, always in wholesale AML roles, for a British bank, for an American bank, for a French bank, for a Japanese bank. First encountered Wolfsberg, working for one of those banks, probably about 2005, 2006. That was around the time the cover payment work was all being done with the clearinghouse and SWIFT, and have been involved with Wolfsberg ever since, and now Wolfsberg c'est moi in a way.
Fantastic, brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Sam. That's really useful, and I think it's a really insightful approach to moving into compliance and financial crime, and I think we've seen it so much over the last number of years, people moving from business roles into compliance and financial crime. Obviously, the Wolfsberg Group is very different to a bank. Could you just give us a bit of an overview of what the Wolfsberg Group is about, its function, and talk a little bit about its kind of future going forward?
Sure. So, I mean, let's start with some basics. I've only ever worked for large banks. When I joined the Wolfsberg Group, I was the staff of one. So that was a massive adjustment in every way. And I had not really anticipated quite how big of an adjustment that would be. So what is the Wolfsberg Group? We're 22 years old. And we came together, the groups that came together to form the Wolfsberg Group, although they didn't know it at the time, were gathering to try and figure out a way to address some of the private banking scandals in the late 1990s. There were scandals in the US, there were scandals in Europe, and it was a group of banks and civil society that got together to try and figure out there has to be a better way. There are no global guidelines for this, and in the absence of global guidelines and widely differing national standards, some alleged that banks were competing for business based on lax compliance standards. So the Wolfsberg first publication was Private Banking Principles, way back in the year 2000, and that's been updated several times since. The organization got together. It was originally, I think, the largest private banks in the countries that were collaborating to try and make sure that it had enough critical mass. And the Private Banking Principles have become a sort of a global standard, a credible private sector series of guidelines for how private banking should be handled. I think there may well have been some thought at the time that this was a one and done exercise, but after what I imagine was some fairly serious wariness about collaborating and talking about compliance standards, people thought that there was value in continuing the group. So in the last 22 years, we've published a whole series of papers, usually standards or frequently asked questions type documents around private banking, correspondent banking, treatment of PEPs, risk assessment, trade principles, which is the fantastic collaboration with the ICC and with BAFT, and the correspondent banking due diligence questionnaire. So a lot of publications, but there are a couple of different things that we do. It's more than just the publications. Because of who sits around the table at Wolfsberg, we have a unique, I think, private sector perspective on how the work is done. So the way I describe it is we're a group of practitioners producing guidance for practitioners. We get involved in some advocacy, especially around regulatory change, and there's the prospect of an awful lot of that coming along. So we are a voice for at the moment. One of the things we're working on is this concept of effectiveness. Better outputs from a financial crime program rather than just more outputs. And so there's that part of our work. There's also the part of the work which is speaking directly to the banking industry and the financial services industry around the world. So if you're in a country trying to figure out how to do part of a financial crime compliance program, take a look at our standards, take a look at our frequently asked questions. Whether you follow them all to the letter is entirely up to you, but it's a very practical way of setting you on your journey as you start building your own program.
I see. And as a group, I suppose I've got a couple of questions. Is the kind of the advice and the publications that you produce, is it just for the group members, or is it for the wider financial crime community and anyone can kind of tap into that knowledge?
It's for the wider financial crime community. I mean, Wolfsberg is a group of 13 banks. When we publish a standard, the standard is really something that is going to change each of our programs or codifies each of our programs. But everything we publish is on the website and it's all available for everybody. And that's largely a recognition that we live in such a connected ecosystem. If you think about correspondent banking, it's all well and good that the 13 members of Wolfsberg follow these principles, but there's thousands of banks around the world. And what we would like is for those banks to be aware of these principles, to be aware of the parameters in the correspondent banking due diligence questionnaire, because the criminals are smart. They'll try and work their way into the system through the weakest link. And if that weakest link is one of our members, as has been demonstrated over the years by some of the hefty fines, then they'll come in that way. But if they can't get in that way, then they'll find a bank in a small jurisdiction that is maybe thinly staffed, lightly regulated, and they'll take advantage of the access point that way.
Sure. Obviously, with the current kind of, the current kind of crisis in Ukraine, sanctions and those sort of things are very much in the public eye at the moment. Has the Wolfsberg Group been involved, or has it thoughts on sort of improving that sort of areas, or does it take a step back?
So, there's such a huge challenge there because the sanctions teams in all of the banks are just overwhelmed getting through the day-to-day. Here's stories of the crazy hours that they're all working because the sanctions regime has changed. It used to be really simple. If Alan Ketley's on the sanctions list issued by the US, he can't do anything in US dollars. Full stop. Since the Crimean sanctions, they've become a lot more nuanced, and the Ukraine/Russia sanctions have continued that. It's, Alan Ketley may be on the list, but it's not a blanket can't do anything. You need to dig into the transaction. What exactly is he trying to do? Because he can do some things, but he can't do other things. And typically that information is not all in the payment instruction, or the bank might feel it's ill-advised just to rely on the snippet, the fragment of information that's in field 70 of the SWIFT payment message. So we haven't published anything. We don't think we're going to publish anything. But one of the things that we do within the group is that we do internal benchmarking and sort of keep in touch type calls. So, common problems benefit from common solutions. So, we don't discuss any customer names or anything confidential like that, but we talk about typologies that we see. We talk about smart solutions that somebody may have thought about. And if you think about who these 13 banks are, and there's no secret, it's on the website, it's listed there. We account for a fairly large proportion of cross-border payment activity. One of the things we are sort of delving into a little bit more is not so much this idea of sort of real-time sanction screening and keeping up with what's going on in the current environment, but what techniques have people found useful in terms of detecting evasion? Because I've long felt this, and I think others in the industry think it as well. If Alan Ketley is sort of on somebody's target area, but he's not listed yet, if he's smart, he's watching to see what's going on. The day that he's listed, if he's smart, he stops transacting in the name of Alan Ketley. He uses a front company or a shell company or a nominee or something else. And I think, the sanctions regimes are good at catching in-flight transactions, and they're good at catching the careless. I think the people who are successful at this are the ones who study it as much as we do. And so, we're not catching them. We're just Alan Ketley's on the list. We're going to catch you now. No, the smart Alan Ketley is way too smart to be tripped up by that, unless somebody is stupid sending him money.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, look, I think that's really, really interesting, and thank you for giving us an overview of the Wolfsberg Group and the work that you guys do. I think it's super important and really, really fascinating. Taking it back to kind of the more personal stuff in terms of your career and within FCC, financial crime compliance. I mean, have you got any kind of top tips for someone wanting to kind of emulate you and the successful career you've had?
Oh my God, I've always been a big fan of that statement. You too can be like me if you're not careful. So I mean, I'd like to say that this all happened by great design, but it didn't. I didn't want to be a banker. My grandfather, who never lived to see me go into a bank, would have been very pleased that I was a banker, but my 17, 18-year-old self couldn't imagine anything less appealing. I got into it and I started to find it really quite fascinating. And so I think, if you're doing something that interests you, that is always the most important thing. And if you're doing it with stimulating and smart people around you, that's even better. Figuring out how to work with different management styles is also useful, because Not everybody does it the same, and you learn a lot from different approaches. And sometimes that transition can be jarring. I went to working for somebody who had an open door policy to somebody who, if I needed to see them, I needed to book something a couple of weeks in advance. So you learn about yourself.
Sure. Yeah.
I think trying to think outside the box is always really important. And I can remember early on in my compliance career sitting around a table trying to solve a particular problem to do with client identification, and a particular client who was being really difficult about providing verification information, ID and verification information. And one of the people around the table said, okay, if the customer won't help us, then why don't we just check the court records and see if the customer's been sued? Because if the customer, you can't sue something that doesn't exist. And a federal court docket identifying the customer as a defendant or a plaintiff is, even it's not in the policy or the procedures anywhere, but it's completely within the spirit of the law in terms of verifying the identity of a particular entity. That was a great idea. I was talking to somebody only last week, and I relayed this sort of suggestion that we'd had, and you see the lights going on in people's eyes. I think it's rather cool. Stay practical. Got to stay practical. In the fin crime world, we struggle with this. How do you create a procedure that is going to succeed? And there's one school of thought that says, let's write it to cover every eventuality, because that way everything is covered. The trouble is you end up with something this thick, and nobody's going to open it. I think you have to keep in mind that you have a bunch of degree holding, loyally trained people can create a document, but it's going to be implemented by people who didn't go to university in the main, for whom it may just be a job. So you've got to keep it simple. You've got to keep it practical. The other thing I would say is just, I came out of sales into this, so maybe I'd sort of look at things slightly differently. I don't think there's enough people that move from the business into compliance, but know what the peers are doing. And believe me, there is nothing more satisfying than a business person saying, well, bank XYZ doesn't do this. Well, actually, I met with them last week and they do. Or alternatively, if somebody else has figured out a better mousetrap, I'm all in favor of that. Because there's no monopoly on good ideas.
Yeah, I think that's super important, and I think that ties in perfectly with your role at the Wolfsberg Group is to kind of pull all those really good ideas together in kind of one spot. Alan, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really, really enlightening, and I think we could probably talk for hours and hours and hours about the nuances within the world of financial crime. Great to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time. We'll leave it there for today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the great work you guys do.